Hi, this is Mark Tolbert with Best Practices team, and this is a replay of a presentation I did for the Washington, D.C. chapter of PMI uh, back in June 25th, downtown for the meeting, the PM and the AM Executive Breakfast Meeting. And the title of the presentation is Thoughts on Agile Hybrid Projects and Risk. We live in a very challenging, interesting world today as project managers. Some words that come to mind, some adjectives that come to mind are extreme volatility, hyper competition, extreme amount of change. Those seems to be the constants. It's Heraclitus, is the famous Greek philosopher, 500 BC, his famous quote where he said that the only thing that's constant is change itself. Well, if anything is true about our world today, that seems to be increasing or even more true. Our customers are very, very demanding and more fickle than ever today. We are fickle. We are very demanding. We have all this technology, all these devices, but we expect instantaneous response times. We want instantaneous access to data, information, entertainment, and if we don't get it instantly, then we're unhappy and we're going to go look for a provider or a solution somewhere else. So definitely that old phrase, make dust or eat dust, applies even more today than perhaps ever before. So it's difficult for companies to survive in this, and therefore it's challenging and difficult for us as project managers. I went out to smallbusinessadministration.gov just to find out about what is the formation rate for companies here in the US every year or every month, and the data that they provided was shocking to me. It just knocked my socks off. And they said that every month here in the US, more than 540,000 new companies are being formed every month. But on the downside, a sobering statistic was that actually more than that, so more than 540,000 companies are going out of business every month too. So what's brought about this new hyper level of competition and volatility in marketplaces, in the economy today? And I think Thomas Friedman's most recent book, That Used to Be Us, How America Fell Behind in the World That It Invented, I think that points out exactly what happened. And as he says, a little over 2 decades ago in the early 90s, two events happened simultaneously that changed the world and brought about all this change. And number one was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And when that occurred, that ushered in this new age of globalization, and some of the countries that were communist countries and were not participating in capitalist marketplaces did so. And of course I'm talking about China and India. So as they entered the capitalist marketplaces and started participating, this ratcheted up the level of competition and the volatility of our marketplaces in major, major ways. We're not just competing, of course, now with other companies here in the US or in Europe. We're competing with companies all over the world. At the same time in the early 90s, we had the advent of the internet, and that changed the game also in major ways for companies and individuals, because now we can communicate very, very easily and very inexpensively with people all over the world. We can collaborate, we can form new partnerships, and this allows new companies to come together. You can cobble together a new company at the drop of a hat. And he points out as an example of this a company called EndoStim. They're developing a proprietary implantable medical device to treat acid reflux. And this company was started first by Cuban and Indian immigrants to the US, and it's funded by St. Louis venture capitalists. The device is going to be manufactured in Uruguay with the help of Israeli engineers and with constant feedback from doctors all over the world in India, the US, Europe, and Chile. The CEO is a South African who was educated in the Sorbonne, but he lives today in Missouri and California, and his principal office is an iPad. So I think this shows us the dynamics and what's happening and why, again, this level of competition has increased so much. So why is this important for us as project managers? Why do we care? Because we're agents of change. We're bringing about change. We're helping our companies survive and address these new marketplaces, this hyper-competitive, very volatile marketplace. We're helping them address that by creating new products, new services, or updating existing products or services. That's what a project's all about. That's really the core definition of a project for PMI. So it's a temporary endeavor to create something new and unique, and that's what we're doing. And a key part of this, with all this volatility and all this change today, to be successful at projects, I believe a core thesis of this presentation is that to be successful in this world, we have to come up to speed and we have to be good at agile project management, but also the traditional project management methods too. So there are two main approaches, two main methodologies for doing project management today. So the two 500-pound gorillas in the room, if you will, for doing project management are the traditional project management approach, which is a waterfall approach, a sequential planning approach. We will plan our project in phases. We will do the project in phases and complete each phase before moving to the next phase. And a lot of times people do associate the PMBOK guide with this traditional approach. Now PMI would take exception to that and say, no, 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 no. The PMBOK guide is a much higher level framework and it supports all methodologies, but there still are some things in the PMBOK guide that are reflective of the waterfall approach. And that's a topic for another paper. We're not going into all of that. But so that's the traditional approach. And what industry did project management come out of? So where did we get project management? So it all comes out of construction. And these original writers on project management, people like Harold Kersner, Cleveland and King, these were engineering professors. And they were writing the main Bible that I had to deal with for project management and getting ready for the PMP exam way back in 1995 was Dr. Kersner's book on project management, a 1,000-page book. And again, it was all based more from the construction angle or engineering angle. And we did things, again, in this waterfall sequential approach. Figure everything out in detail. Get all of your plans figured out in detail. The devil's in the details. So don't leave any stones unturned. Get it all figured out up front in a number of planning phases and exhaustively get all of the requirements from the different stakeholders and roll that up into a scope statement. Very detailed narrative scope statement, might be 30, 40 pages long for a number of projects, laying out what the SLAs are, the service level agreements, and exactly what the deliverables are, and exactly what the acceptance criteria are for these different deliverables. And then even go further, don't stop there. So take that scope statement and break it down even much more finely into a work breakdown structure and hierarchically break down scope till you get down to that very detailed level of the work packages, and keep on going farther from there. Take these work packages and decompose them even farther down to the activities that make up the schedule. So do all this in-depth planning up front and figure it all out. This is a predictive planning approach. Agile is the new kid on the block. It's not so new right now. So the Agile Manifesto was released in February of 2001, so that's over 13 years ago, but it's still pretty much the thought of as the new approaches for doing project management, and where the traditional approach was waterfall and exhaustively predict all the requirements up front. Agile methodologies are all about figure it out iteratively. So figure it out in increments, in sprints or in iterations, and learn, explore, discover the requirements as you go through the project in these iterations or in these sprints. So Agile is really an umbrella term, and at minimum it refers to at least these 6 different more specific methodologies mentioned underneath it: Scrum, XP or Extreme Programming, Lean, Crystal, DSDM, so Dynamic Systems Development Method, and then FDD, Feature Driven Development. So all of these are more iterative approaches for figuring out requirements and doing the project in iterations or in increments. Scrum is overwhelmingly the most popular of all these more specific methodologies. Over 90% of the people who are using Agile today are really doing Scrum. So this is a different approach. So some key points that we'll be making in this presentation are that, as we said before, that to be successful in this very hyper-competitive, very volatile world today, for projects, as project managers, we must come up to speed and be good at Agile project management as well as traditional project management methods. And the reason is that Agile gives us some very nice new tools and approaches for dealing with major risks on our projects, and we want to take advantage of that. But of course, we still should have in our hip pocket an understanding of how to do things the traditional way too. For this to all work, we're going to have to involve the customer much more completely and much more frequently in all aspects of the project than we did with the traditional method. So that's going to be vital. One thing that management's going to have to do and the customer's going to have to do is allow for a much more enlightened management philosophy and style for our teams. They're going to have to empower the teams, provide more freedom and trust. And for those of you familiar with the PMBOK guide materials and getting ready for the PMP exam, this new culture is going to align itself mostly with what we termed Theory Y concepts or management by objective concepts. But there's just no one simple tool, one simple methodology that can be used in all situations for solving problems. Again, we need to come up to speed with both methods. Students in PMP prep classes always want to know, well, what's the best way to solve a problem? What's the PMI recommended way to solve a problem? And the answer that they hate, that's really the right answer in all these situations, is it depends. It depends on what type of project world we're in. What's the company trying to do? Are we trying to create something new? Are we trying to update something? Are we trying to respond to some new law or regulation? So it depends on what we're trying to accomplish in the project. It depends on what type of contract governs the project. So there's all sorts of variables that depends on what approach, and there's a lot of art and science to it. And also, we'll find out that Agile is not just a tool that's for project managers and the project teams. It's something, again, that should be used throughout the company and can help program managers, product managers figure out the right set of products to address marketplaces, and even for the company overall to help them really do portfolio management. So again, if we're good at project management, if we're good project managers, we're really paying close attention to risk. It's absolutely fundamental and necessary that we do this. And as I said earlier, this assists us doing work in all the other 9 knowledge areas. It helps us get better estimates, ensure our requirements are correct, that documents haven't been left out, that they're clearly written. We're driving out ambiguity, we're driving out vagueness, we're making our requirements smart, specific, measurable, agreed, realistic, and time-bound. And risk helps us do that. And We cannot be proactive unless we're doing risk well. If we're issuing PMI's favorite type of change request, which is, of course, a preventive change request, we're out in front of change, we're proactively seeing things that could cause us to go off schedule, to go over budget. The only way we're doing that is if we've identified a number of risks, put them into the risk register, and we're on the lookout for those negative risks. And we have response plans and strategies that we define and put into place to help us mitigate those risks, avoid them altogether, or outsource them, transfer them to somebody else. So unless we're doing risk well, we can't be proactive. So again, it's absolutely fundamental and necessary that we do this. So, and we're looking at risks in all sorts of different categories. And I'm borrowing this one from Doug DeCarlo and an excellent book that Mr. DeCarlo wrote called Extreme Project Management. So before reading Mr. DeCarlo's book, I always started out my risk breakdown structure with, of course, risks at the top. And then underneath that, I next level down, I went down to internal risks and then external risks. And I like the way Doug DeCarlo has done this much better. So he breaks down risks into business risks, the risk of profit or loss. Do we have what it takes to pull off this product? Do we know what the customer is really looking for, what senior management's looking for? Have we identified that? Is that clear? And then there's both product risk and project risk. So just like there's product scope and project scope, just like there's product quality and project quality, there's also product risk and project risk. And product risk is about what are the technical challenges for creating this new product or service, and do we have what it takes? Have we done this before? Is this part of our core skill sets? Is this something entirely new? Well, if it is, pretty much of it is brand new to us, then there are serious technical risks for us to achieve scope or quality. So that's product risk, technical risk for achieving this product. And project risk is how tightly constrained is the project for budgets, for schedule, for resources, for other things. And if we've got very tight constraints on our baselines and resources and things like that, then we've got major project risk. And then, of course, organizational risks, political risks. Again, we're bringing about change. Does everybody like change? Well, of course not. Some people are going to lose power. Some people are losing influence. People's goals just don't line up with other key stakeholders. And as project managers, we got to figure all that out too. So organizational risks have to be figured out too. So we're addressing risk in all these different subcategories in our risk breakdown structure. And again, as we said, Agile is going to provide us some unique ways of doing this, different from the traditional methods. So what are our major risks on a project? And let's start with numero uno. What's the main cause of project failure? What is the principal cause of project failure that's cited in almost all of the project management books and literature? And it's a poorly written scope statement, a vague, ambiguous scope statement. We didn't get all of the requirements. We didn't understand the customer correctly. We missed some of the stakeholders and we missed getting their requirements. That's going to come back to bite us. So those are key things. Missed requirements, misunderstood requirements, missed stakeholders. Those are critical. That's death. If we don't do this right, typically on a project, what's going to happen? Once we've created this new product, this new service, this deliverable, once we've created it and we bring the customer in to formally approve it in our process, validate scope, in scope management, one of the key monitoring controlling processes there, what's going to happen? They're not going to sign off on the deliverable. They're not going to accept it. We're going to hear, well, this isn't it. This isn't what I asked for. Weren't you listening? It's got to have these other requirements too. I've got to have these other features, or I need these other reports provided as part of this application, something like that. And if our scope statement was vague, if it was ambiguous, if the acceptance criteria were not clearly written, guess what? We're doing it. We don't have a leg to stand on, and we're adding those extra requirements at our expense on our dime. So also we've got to set the customer's expectations. That's a key part that must be in the scope statement. We must clearly tell them not only what's in scope, but what's not in scope. So that's a key part that should be in the scope statement. And again, the requirements have to be very well detailed, as well as the acceptance criteria. They need to be SMART, and I'm sure you've heard that acronym. So again, S is specific, M is measurable, A is 3 or 4 things. So agreed, acceptable, attainable, achievable, pretty much all meaning the same thing. Yes. R is realistic, some people say reasonable, and T is time bound. So we want them to be all these things. So in the PMBOK guide and with the traditional project management approach, what do we do to avoid this major cause of project failure, to get it right for the scope statement? Well, we did predictive planning. Figure everything out in depth up front, do a detailed scope statement, detailed narrative scope statement, break everything down, make sure that we've got clear acceptance criteria that are SMART, and that should help protect us from that major risk. Now, there shouldn't be any room for argument when it comes time for the customer to come in and accept the deliverable. There can't be any room for argument. It's going to be clear whether we met scope or not. And we go even farther than creating the scope statement, do we not? So we continue in our progressive elaboration, we continue in our detailed planning. So we take the scope statement, and of course then we drill down to a work breakdown structure. We decompose the scope statement hierarchically and create this work breakdown structure. And this is the heart and soul of planning. It drives all other planning for the project. It helps us do the scheduling. It helps us get our cost estimates and then do budgeting. It helps us figure out risks for the project. It helps us figure out what we want to outsource. And big part, again, the WBS is a huge part of doing earned value. So we're incorporating earned value for really doing things right with the traditional approach as part of this. And if we do it this way, we should have nailed everything down. There won't be any room for disagreement when it comes time for the customer to sign off on the deliverables. So will this predictive approach, this waterfall approach, is this going to work in software? Is this going to work in projects with a lot of volatile requirements? And probably not. It's probably not going to work. We can do everything right and get a very clearly written scope statement and still fail. Well, let's see why. So let's look at a very simple SDLC, software development lifecycle, using a waterfall approach for software, and we'll see why doing predictive planning, trying to do detailed predictive planning up front, is still not going to work and allow us to be successful in meeting the customer's needs. And by the way, this is how I did programming and software way back in the 70s. So no, I don't mind dating myself. I was doing COBOL to support the family back in the 1970s. And this is kind of how we did things. We did a conceptual design phase. We went out to exhaustively try to collect all the user requirements, and we might spend well over a month, maybe a couple months of time canvassing different stakeholders for the project and seeing what they're doing and what types of reports they want and what screen layouts they want, and try in detail, voluminously, exhaustively to collect all these different requirements and put together a user requirements document, a functional specification for this application. And we would get that all completed. We would tie a bow around the user requirements and get sign off, get senior management, the customer, signing off on the user requirements. And then we were ready to move on into what we called the detailed design phase. So we called it system architecture or subsystem specs. And we started defining in more detail the application, and we hierarchically broke down the application into different programs, and we broke down programs down into modules, and modules down into subroutines, and subroutines down to paragraphs, and so on. Like a WBS, we were hierarchically breaking down this entire application and figuring out the file layouts and sometimes even writing pseudocode for this application. And we could spend easily 3 months, 4 months, maybe even 6 months for a large application doing the detailed design, the subsystem specs. And again, we got it all done. It was all complete. We came in, we brought the customer in, we brought senior management in, and there was a formal sign off and approval. We tied a bow around that stage, and then we went on to programming or development, and the programmers started writing all the COBOL code. And it could take a long time. Back in those days, it might take well over a year to write the code for 100,000 lines of code, a fairly typical amount of code for an application back in those days. It might take well over a year of time to write all of that code. And it goes through its unit testing, and people get all the programs debugged and do unit testing, passes that, we tie a bow around that, and we go to integrated testing or user acceptance testing. So now it's taken what? How long has it taken to get this application done? Well, it easily could be a year and a half, maybe 2 years. Now what's happened in those 2 years? The world has changed. New technologies are available, new capabilities, functionality for how to handle screens, other things, new database indexing schemes are available. Guess what? The customer wants this new technology. But it's even more true that it's not until they finally get the new application and they get to use it and see it and kick the tires, so to speak, that they realize and figure out what they really needed in the first place. And you know what is almost for sure? They're not going to be very happy with the existing design as it is. They're going to want changes. So we could have done almost a perfect job canvassing them, getting all the requirements, getting all the report layouts and screen layouts, and still when we deliver the application to them, it's not what they really need. This application could meet scope, it could meet the requirements defined in the scope statement for the application, but fail quality. It doesn't work right. It doesn't meet Duran's. I love Joseph Duran's definition for quality. Quality is fitness for use. It's the definition that strikes the best at. To meet quality, it goes farther than scope, and the product, the service, has to work right and meet customer satisfaction. And we could have done everything that we said we were going to do up front in the scope statement and still fail on that count. So just to summarize, using a predictive waterfall type approach for software or projects really with any type of volatility and volatile requirements is probably not going to work. You can do everything you set out to do and exhaustively get all these requirements, and you're hoping that you won't have too much change. You're hoping that you did everything so well up front in all of your plans that you're not going to need change. You're trying to prevent unnecessary change. But because it takes so long to get this application out, and the world has changed, and the customer didn't know up front what they really needed in the beginning, you're going to end up delivering something to them that's not completely satisfactory. So instead of using this predictive approach, waterfall approach, to try to canvass all the stakeholders and exhaustively get all of the requirements up front, why not pull them in iterations using prototypes? And why is this going to be more effective? Because when we did the push approach or the predictive approach and got all of these requirements and erred on the side of inclusiveness, is the customer really going to use all those requirements? Do they really need all those requirements? Of course not. What does the federal government do? Just another, for those of you that have worked in the federal government market, what does classically the federal government do to us in an RFP? They include everything under the sun ever dreamed of for requirements in this RFP. And even very large companies like the one where I worked for almost all my career, Hewlett-Packard, or for IBM, even huge companies like this can't even meet all of the requirements that the government's asking for. So we have to go partner with other companies to try to fill all these gaps, places that we can't meet the requirements. But is the government ever going to use all of this stuff, all of these requirements? No, of course not. A standard survey of several years ago pointed out that fully 65% of requirements that a customer thinks they need absolutely have to have going in, 65% of those requirements will never be used. And another version of Pareto's law is at play here. And of course, we know for quality that Pareto's law is that 80% of our problems comes from 20% of the causes. Well, for requirements, another version of Pareto's law is 80% of the customer's need will come from 20% of the requirements. So why not go after that 20% in our first iterations? So we figure out what's most important, what's most urgent, what's most risky, and we go after those top requirements in the early iterations, and we try to get something out very quickly to the customer and let them kick the tires, let them use it, let them try it out, find out what they like, what's of value, and what's not of value. The stuff that's not of value, we take it out of the product backlog. We take it out of the requirements for the project. We don't invest in it further. We don't design more and more interfaces between these requirements and other things downstream. We trim it out. That saves us an enormous amount of time and, of course, money. We want these iterations to be quick. So in Scrum, they need to be 2 to 4 weeks. To be able to achieve that, we need dedicated teams, highly experienced, capable teams that are co-located so that they can work better together and achieve this backlog, the sprint backlog for the iteration very, very quickly. So we've got to do that. But if we can get things out to the customer very, very quickly and let them test it, let them play with it, find out what's of value and what's not of value, then we're going to deliver things, products to them that are much more useful in a much more timely way, and we're going to save them money in the bargain also. So we're trying to achieve, as Doug DeCarlo says, we're trying to identify fast failures or identify failures fast. Find out what's not of value. And that kind of goes along hand in hand with a core concept called MMF, or minimum marketable features. Just go after the features, the minimum set of features that we know are valuable. The things that we're not so sure of, we delay them, we push them out, and we give it more time to find out whether the customer really needs them or not. And another great quote out of Doug DeCarlo's book that sums this all up and captures it very well, and he says, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 pictures. So this is a great idea for helping figure out requirements for the customer that are going to be of more value. And in software and projects with volatile requirements, this is a much better fit. But in order for this to work, the customer has got to buy in, and senior management also have to buy in and understand that we're doing things much, much differently than we were with the traditional method. So again, the traditional method, the predictive method, exhaustively figure out all the requirements, nail them down, lock them down airtight into our scope statement and acceptance criteria. That was a real good fit for places where the customer knew up front going into the project what they really wanted. It was a much better fit for fixed price, firm fixed price. In the firm fixed price world, the customer knows what they want going into the project, and they'll be choosing between vendors mostly on price. And we can nail down as clearly as possible what their requirements are and what the acceptance criteria will be for the deliverables. But now things are quite different. Now they don't know what they want going into the project, and we're going to discover those requirements and explore those requirements in these iterations and find out what's of value and what's not of value. But we're not in fixed price anymore. Fixed price is not a very good fit for this. How can I give you a fixed price for something that you don't even know very clearly what it is that you want? How can I give you a fixed price for that? How can you expect me to do that? So we're much more in a cost reimbursable world. You understand that we're exploring these requirements and discovering them. So you should be picking, you, the customer, you should be picking up the cost for this and adding on a profit. So cost reimbursable or perhaps time and materials. So we're handling that risk for scope much differently. We still could go fixed price. Fixed price, and a lot of people want fixed price today. And with the economy the way it is, and things are still struggling in many places, the customer has a lot more clout in that type of economy, and they want fixed price because that's where they have the least risk. So yes, Mr. Customer, Mrs. Customer, will still give you fixed price for delivering this, but now what? Now it's much differently. We're going to fix. In the old classic, let's rewind the tape here. In the old classic world, in following through the planning processes in the PMBOK guide in the order, we first figured out scope in depth, right? We went and did collect requirements. We got all the requirements. We rolled that up into a scope statement, a detailed narrative scope statement with the acceptance criteria, the boundaries and such. We broke that down even further hierarchically into the work breakdown structure. And again, that was the heart and soul of planning and allowed us to figure out the schedule, allowed us to figure out costs, figure out risks, figure out what we want to outsource, figure out quality, and do all those other good things. So the old school, traditional school, we first figured out scope, and then we went and figured out time and cost. Now with Agile, we're turning that upside down. And we're going with, for each iteration, we're going with a fixed schedule. Again, in Scrum, we're going with an iteration of 2 to 4 weeks. So schedule is constrained. We know what the schedule is for each iteration. And also we constrain our cost. We know how many resources are going to be working within each sprint or within each iteration. I'm going to have 6 to 8 senior, dedicated, co-located resources, so I know what my costs are. So I fix time and I fix cost, and I'm exploring scope. So scope will be variable. Well, I can still give you a fixed price with that model. So we'll fix the number of iterations. We'll say we're not going to do more than perhaps 10 iterations, and I know what the costs are for each iteration, so I can give you a fixed price. But Mr. Customer, I'm not guaranteeing what I'm giving to you at the end of those 10 iterations. I'm not guaranteeing any specific detailed design requirements. We're exploring those. We're discovering those. So we think we can pretty much guarantee to you, you're going to end up with something of higher value than if we try to do all the in-depth planning up front. We just don't know exactly what it's going to be. We're going to explore it. So you have to buy into that concept and understand there's going to be flexibility with scope. If we're fixing the price and it's fixed price and we're fixing the number of iterations, then there's flexibility with what exactly we're going to end up with. Or if you're allowing that this can go on and on until we do give you exactly the quality or what you wanted, then the cost is variable because the number of iterations could be different. So we're handling that main risk for scope in an entirely different way. For this to work, there's got to be, again, much more involvement for the customer, and there's more flexibility and there's more trust. We can't have a situation where we're not really trusting the customer and we get partway into this project, we get into the 3rd or 4th, 5th sprint, and the customer starts changing the game on us and says, you know what, I know I signed off on those earlier sprints and the prototypes, but now I'm recognizing, yeah, that's not really what I want, and I want to throw all that out and start over again, and I don't want to pay you for those earlier sprints either. That's not part of the game, and so we've got to write up the contract for this in such a way to protect us from that. That classic slide from project management training, fundamentals training, and even PMP classes that shows us the trends for stakeholder influence and the cost of change explains very clearly what's going on here and how we're handling cost of change much differently in Agile than in traditional projects. So we all know, we've all seen that when do stakeholders have the most influence on a project? And everybody quickly answers and says, of course, it's at the beginning of the project, when we'd only have those user requirements, because we haven't spent that much money getting those user requirements. We didn't have too many people involved. It didn't take too much time. And then, so the cost of change was very low at the beginning of the project, so therefore stakeholders had more influence. And then once we got the detailed design done, we've got our blueprints done, or those subsystem specs done, that system architecture, now we've invested more time, we had people more involved, so it's much more expensive to change that. If the customer changes their mind about significant requirements, functional requirements for this project at that point, well, that's going to be a lot more expensive and more painful to change that. So stakeholder influence is an inverse of cost of change. Their influence starts dropping off in a linear way because the cost of change is increasing in a linear way. But the preceding slide was deceptive and misleading. It made it look like the cost of change was just increasing linearly, but it wasn't, is it? So when do we traditionally bring in the customer to check out the application for software? Not until the very end. Not until we're doing integrated testing do we bring in the customer and do user acceptance testing. So the cost of change wasn't linear. It's exponential towards the end. It increases dramatically at the end because that's where we bring in the customer, and we've invested so much writing all the code and doing all the unit testing up to that point. Now, if they come up with whole new requirements or make fairly major changes in the project, what its functional requirements are, we're throwing out major sections of the application, and the costs are enormous because we're bringing in the customer at the very end. In Agile, we're changing all of that. We're bringing in the customer for each iteration, or a spokesperson for the customer. The product owner is coming in at the end of each iteration to do acceptance testing. Basically, in each sprint, in each iteration, we're really doing all aspects of all phases. So it's a vertical slice of the project in each phase. We're doing really essentially all phases in each iteration. And of course, underneath all these phases of release planning, conceptual design, detailed design, and so on, underneath that, we have the classic process groups, the 5 process groups, working and whirling away underneath that. But the key part is we're doing acceptance testing at the end of each iteration, so we're flattening out the cost of change. There isn't going to be just one big spike at the end of the project. So this is going to have huge benefits and big payoffs. We're flattening that out. We're not having that crazy change at the end. And what is senior management? What is the customer? What do they hate above all else? Surprises, negative surprises. And so we're flattening that out. We're not going to have that big whopping negative surprise at the end of the project. But Agile is not only iterative life cycles and using prototyping and discovering and exploring requirements through iterations throughout the project. There's much, much more that's involved. And the Agilists like to say, for this to work, you've got to come up with this new culture, a new way of thinking. They don't want any longer that old PMI kind of defined project manager, the command and control project manager who was doing the predictive planning, putting together this very robust project management plan and handing out pieces of the plans to different team members who then went and executed against it. And the command and control project manager was basically almost micromanaging them as they executed against the plan. They say, we don't want that. That's not going to work. We need a lot more freedom. We need a lot more trust. We need that, again, more of an environment of management by objectives, theory Y culture that allows these teams to work at this very high performance level and achieve a very compressed schedule that's needed to achieve these sprints and get something useful out, a prototype. It's not just a prototype that will be thrown away. The idea is create something of use, something that can be put into production, even if it is minimum features that we're building out. It should be something that's productive that can be put into use. And for that to occur, to be able to achieve those goals, we need this very empowered team. And I think a lot of the Agilists think that they're conceiving of something brand new, this new culture, this Agile ethos is something brand new, and it's really not. And in Silicon Valley, in all of tech, in California, on the West Coast, almost all these tech companies in the mid 70s through the 80s and most of the 90s adopted this very same type of culture, and it's what worked best for these companies. And certainly in my company, in Hewlett Packard, they invested in this culture, and in fact they might have invented this culture. They started out with this was part of their conception of how a company should be run at the very beginning. Even in this company started in 1939, and by the early 40s they had written their HP way. And what's being described here for the Agile ethos was exactly, a big part of this was just exactly what they were describing for the HP way. And they said, we believe people want to do a good job, and we're going to provide them that opportunity. We're going to provide them the training they need. We're going to provide them the tools they need. And we're going to trust in them. We believe the people closest to the problem will have the best solutions. So we're not going to micromanage them. We'll define at a high level the strategic goals. We'll do management by objective, define high level goals, and trust and believe that the people closest to the problem will come up with the best solutions. And this worked incredibly well for them. And a lot of the naysayers will say, the skeptics will say, of course that worked well. This more of this country club type atmosphere worked great in the heyday of mini computers and computers. So from the mid 70s on, and you had these huge profit margins for your computers, of course this worked well. But they're forgetting, no, this worked long before these companies before Hewlett Packard and other companies got into computers. Hewlett Packard started out as a very small test and measurement company at its beginning, and this same culture worked very, very well. A part of this, another thing they said, is we believe that our employees are our most valuable resource, and we're investing in them. And they back that up too. They provide financial incentives. So a great profit sharing program and stock program was also part of the picture. And they had very motivated teams that did do some great things and achieved some amazing stuff. And almost all of Silicon Valley adopted this strategy. So one last editorial comment about this. It breaks my heart to see that a lot of companies have dropped this view and kind of run away from this culture and have gone from theory Y to theory X almost, or definitely moved away from this culture. And it's ironic. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what they're thinking. The two most successful companies still in tech out there that are achieving great things are Google and Apple. And of course, they still have this culture, this mindset. It works very well. So what's wrong? Wake up, smell the coffee. This works very well. More companies should get on board. Maybe, I'm really going off in the deep end here, going off on a tangent. Maybe this is part of the solution for income disparity today. If more companies adopted this type of philosophy and truly provided the incentives for their teams, maybe this would help address some of that income disparity between upper management and the other people working in the company. So we've seen that Agile methodologies give us some whole new tools for dealing with our major risk on projects. And again, that's the risk. The main cause of project failure, again, is a poorly written scope statement. And we've seen that Agile has given us a whole nother approach for dealing with that. That in software, in volatile projects, or projects with volatile requirements, it's not enough just to have a very clearly written scope statement, because the customer didn't know what they want up front. And we're going to explore and we're going to discover what those requirements are. But we're turning that all around, and the customer has to buy in that we're in more of a cost reimbursable model, or that even if we're going with fixed price, there's not a guarantee of what we're giving to them at the end of the 10 sprints that were fixed, or however number of sprints that were fixed. So it's a very nice set of tools that help us deal with that classic risk in software and in projects with volatile projects. But there's a very important second key risk that bedevils a lot of projects and really a lot of companies, and it's allowing half-baked ideas to survive. So way back in 1995, when I'm working on my PMP, and the requirements for getting education hours or contact hours were actually more stringent back at that time. So Hewlett-Packard sent me up to Boston University to attend a 2-day conference on project management to help earn the number of these contact hours that I needed for my application. And there were many presentations that were given in those 2 days. They awarded prizes for the best presentations. The #1 prize-winning paper was a paper written by Gopal Kapoor entitled 10 Dumb Mistakes That Project Managers Make. And the #1 mistake was allowing half-baked ideas to survive. So it's not really as much a project manager's mistake as it's a senior manager's mistake. And many companies make this mistake. They allow some half-baked product idea to survive, go on soaking up very valuable resources and stealing those resources and money away from other much more deserving projects. And sometimes it even leads to the demise of the company by allowing that to happen. So how did we deal with that in the classic way? So the classic way to deal with this is to do project selection. And this was a big part of the PMP exam before version 4 and version 5. They're starting to weed it out now. But it was really something that the sponsor and senior management should be doing to find out what projects they should go after, which projects should be included in the company's portfolio. And they brought us in as project managers to consult with them and assist them on doing this project selection and do things like net present value, figure out the internal rate of return and the payback period, use perhaps economic value add to figure out which projects are going to have the best ROI, going to have the best return for the company and that which they should invest in. So they're using these analytic techniques like net present value and internal rate of return, or even modeling and simulation. They might even do Monte Carlo or modeling, constrained optimization to model out and project, forecast what project's going to have the biggest return. Well, Agile's bringing to bear, again, very, very good tools to help them do project selection, because are we not? We're identifying failures fast. So very early in our project lifecycle, in our early iterations, we're figuring out what has value and what doesn't have value. We're using lean. We're identifying fast failures, and things that don't have value, we weed that out. Or maybe we just make up our mind that this whole concept, and the customer makes up their mind that this whole concept is half-baked. We don't really have what it's going to take to get this done. And we kill the project. We stop the project. That might be something that Agile helps us with. So we do project selection up front to decide what project to go after to begin with, but also as we move through the project, we should keep reevaluating what's the business case. Do we have what it takes? So kind of a classic waterfall concept here. We typically did kill points and phase gate reviews as we move from phase to phase to phase through our project. And basically the phase gate is asking a question: did we finish the work for the preceding phase? Did we complete the deliverables for the preceding phase? And the kill point decision asks something a little bit different. It's asking, does the business case still exist? Are we going to make a return? Do we have what it takes? Has the competition totally leapfrogged what we were planning to do? Can we get this done in the right time frame and hit the right market window? And no one might have erred. We might have done everything according to plan, exactly on schedule, within cost, and it might become apparent as we get through detailed design or even into coding that this isn't going to work. This is a half-baked idea. Kill the project. So Agile, since we're doing our iterations much more quickly and we're getting real products, we're not just simulating things, we're not just analytically figuring out the internal rate of return or net present value, we're getting something tangible, empirical out in front of the customer and senior management. It makes them I think it makes it much easier for them to make these kill point decisions. In Gopal Kapoor's article, 10 Dumb Mistakes Project Managers Make, the number one mistake was the one we just mentioned, and that is allowing half-baked ideas to survive and therefore soak up valuable company resources and steal those resources from other much more deserving investments and projects. The number two mistake was our mistake, was clearly a project manager's mistake. And the number two mistake he mentioned is failing to keep senior management advised of what's happening in the project, to not keep them in the loop about our project's progress or status. And of course, that is sheer death for the project too, isn't it? What does senior management hate above all else? Surprises, and negative surprises on that. And if we use Agile, though, it gives us another tool. Are we not keeping them much more in the loop? Because we're flattening out that cost of change curve by bringing the product owner in, or even the customer in, or senior management in at the end of every sprint, of every iteration, to check out what the deliverable is, what the prototype is that's a result of this iteration. We're keeping them much more in the loop with what's happening in this project, and they're getting to see it. This is empirical. They can observe what the results are for this project, and we're not just analytically using net present value or internal rate of return or payback period or doing modeling to figure out what we think the value, the return on investment will be for the project. So the traditional methods were more analytic, and this method is much more empirical, much more about discovery, and it's definitely keeping the customer and the product owner and other senior managers much more involved and much more aware of what's happening in our project. So we've seen how Agile methodologies help us in a more empirical way with several of our biggest risks on the project, by using Lean, by discovering failures fast, by using this iterative approach to explore requirements, discover requirements, and find out what's really of value and what's not of value. It really helps us deal with risks for scope and also for product risk, finding out very early on in the project whether we have the right skill sets in the team to create this product in the right time frame for the right cost, and do it with real data, with real facts, do this empirically. So it definitely helps us with some of those classic risks. We've seen it helps us with business risks, again, by identifying failures fast, identifying fast failures. It definitely helps us avoid that problem of allowing half-baked ideas to survive. But it also helps us in this more empirical manner with risks and all these other subcategories in the risk breakdown structure. So traditionally, classically, if we're not sure, if the team is not really sure how long it's going to take to do a certain activity, classically, what do? We use what? We use quantitative risk analysis techniques. We start with PERT estimates, and that helps us construct probability distributions, or we do Monte Carlo simulations. We do analytical techniques to add a buffer or add schedule reserve time into the activity duration to protect us from risks, and then that rolls all up into the schedule baseline. And that translates into contingency reserves, cost contingency reserves for the cost baseline. So classically, traditionally, we use these analytical techniques like PERT, expected monetary value, Monte Carlo, to construct contingency reserves. Well, Agile helps us deal with those risks of possible duration delays or cost overruns with activities in an empirical way. So we measure our velocity as we go through the project, and we see how fast we're turning out the product backlog, how fast we're turning out stories. We measure our velocity, and we can do forecasts and projections and see more accurately how long this project is going to really take and whether we're on track to finish when we thought. So it's just generally it's a more empirical approach for dealing with many risks in many parts of the risk breakdown structure. So Agile's the solution for all of our project management problems, right? Of course not. That's very silly. There is no one methodology, one specific approach that solves all of our problems in all situations. There's a lot of art and science to good project management, and what does it all really boil down to? People skills, soft skills, communication skills, and it's just flat out hard work. Ironing out all those differences and teasing out all those nuances and all the communications, getting all the stakeholders, getting all the requirements and getting them all together on the same page, ironing out all the inconsistencies and working our meetings in an effective way so we have true understanding, true communications going on. Agile can really help us in those ways too, can't it? If we're following the prescribed pattern though, if we can get our teams all co-located together and dedicated to the project, which is pretty doggone hard to do in many company environments. I know that would be asking for a lot in my environment back where I worked. To even get one or two dedicated people full-time to the project was usually quite difficult. But if we can get that, and if we can get everybody co-located, what did we just solve? We just got rid of phone tag. We just got rid of delays waiting for responses for emails. And our communications will be much more effective too if we're all co-located. How many times have we received an email from a key stakeholder on a project, perhaps a customer, a senior manager, another key team member, and we're not really sure what they meant in the email message or why they said what they said, and we're wondering in between the lines, is there a problem here? Is there something going on? Why did they say it that way? Well, if we're co-located and we can just get up out of our chair and go visit with them and talk to them face to face and see all the body language and the expressions and such, it's going to be much more obvious what they really meant, and there's probably not going to be any real mystery in the communication. So it's going to help communications and these soft skills and people skills be more effective too if we can do that. So in summary, it helps us solve some of the classic problems with risk, but it's just one of the solutions. And yes, there of course are going to be many times where we need to use the traditional methods to do predictive planning. And there's many places where that's the best fit. Some projects are just best suited for that, and even parts of projects can be suited for that today. So this just follows up on that last point. Where is traditional project management and predictive planning a better fit? Probably for these bullets that are being outlined here. Again, Agile, it's kind of a misfit to use Agile in the firm fixed price environment. Traditional project management, predictive planning is much more of a likely fit for that. We can do it, but again, the customer's got to understand that even though we're in firm fixed price, we're not promising any specific design details for the product or deliverable or service at the end of these iterations. We're going to explore and discover what these design requirements are. So if there's a lack of trust with the customer or other key stakeholders on the project that they're accepting that, then we better go back and do things the old-fashioned way, the predictive way. If we're subcontracting major parts of the project to vendors that we don't have a lot of data on, or we don't have that kind of smooth relationship in the past, then we need to do that part of the project in the classic way. If we're in a virtual team environment, that's making it more tricky. Again, much better if we're co-located and people are dedicated to the project. If they're multi-processing and working on many things at once, it's going to be hard to achieve those very 2 to 4 week time capsuled sprints. It's going to make it more difficult. So we might want to do that the more classic way. And if the project's just very complex and there's many interrelationships and interfaces between parts, we might need to spend more time up front planning everything out in detail. So I think in the real world, for most people working on Agile, they end up finding out that some parts of their project do have components like this, and they really need to go with more of a hybrid approach. And just to repeat and summarize, another point we've made, I think, a couple of times in this presentation is that Agile is an excellent tool to help us with many facets of project management, but it has much more broad application than that. And we need to send program managers, product managers, and even other senior managers to training on Agile so that they can learn how it will help them do program management and figure out what set of products will best meet the business need for the product managers and the product owners, and even for portfolio management. We could do that in an Agile way. Many companies are doing that. Many companies, especially in tech, like to advertise how agile they are, how quickly they're turning over their product lines and getting out new features and products. And so I think most companies are recognizing in many areas that need to be agile. So in conclusion, we've seen that Agile brings to project management and even product management a whole set of tools that allow us to deal with some of our biggest risks on projects, help us avoid that scenario of a poorly written scope statement or delivering a product that did not really meet the customer's need. And it also helped us address that issue within companies for project selection of allowing the half-baked ideas to survive and soak up very valuable resources from other projects and other investments. So if we do Agile well, we're going to help to deal with those biggest risks. But as we've also seen, we need to be good at not just Agile, but also at traditional project management and have all these different skill sets in our back pockets and know how and when to use them. And probably most of our projects today are going to involve some of both techniques and approaches. Some, they're hybrid projects and are going to involve using both Agile and the traditional approaches. And last, again, for this to really work, it's especially important for the customer to be much more actively involved in the projects. Name at least a representative, the product owner that's speaking for them, and do customer acceptance in every sprint. We're flattening out that cost of change curve by doing so. They also have to provide a lot more freedom and trust to the teams, and hopefully allow for co-located, dedicated teams. If we're going to achieve this very compressed, very fast time frame for sprints, we need to provide that type of environment. And it helps us not just with project management, but also with product management and portfolio management. If you're interested in reading further into these topics, here are some excellent books and references that I used for putting together this presentation. Thank you very much for your time listening to this presentation. I hope you found this helpful, and I'd love to hear your comments and your feedback. So please reach out to me at the email listed on the slide, or even give me a call.